Hello everybody. Here at the my favorite place to make videos these days. And I'd just like to remind you all that I don't think my face is all that interesting. And since with my phone you can't really see my hand gestures, and one of my hands is held hostage by the phone, you don't have to watch the videos, right? Unless you really want to see my facial expressions. You can just listen, yeah? You can just listen, maybe while you're walking, or whatever's going on, whatever's happening in your day, driving. If it's safe to listen while you're driving, yeah, you can just listen in. So this is kind of cool. I don't know if you can see it because I can't tell when I turn the video. I can't tell what it's focused on. Let's see here. But there's a big raven over by this cedar, and it wasn't too concerned about being approached by a human. Looks like this cedar lost a big branch recently. I can see a place where something has cracked off from it. Oh, here's other members of the clan. I'm trying to point as best I can at the phenomenon, at the beings. So I'm going to show you one of our fountains here because it'll be useful in a moment. This is, let's see, I cannot see well enough. There we go. So this is one of the fountains in the garden. And you can see there's a central cavity there. And I noticed a couple approach the fountain and try to fill their bottles from the drinking nozzles, which was perfectly natural because they haven't seen anything like that fountain before. But the central cavity is designed to fill bottles, right? So it has a button underneath it. You can put your bottle in there and just push the button and it'll fill vertically. Whereas trying to fill your bottle horizontally is going to be very challenging and difficult and possibly confusing. So I was hoping to use the fountain to rinse my hands off. And I approached them. The man had already filled his bottle quite with great difficulty from the fountain nozzle, and the woman was going at hers. And I explained to them, I said, pardon me, I just thought I'd let you know this cavity in the center is for filling bottles. Immediately the man's face turned red, and he was kind of a tough looking guy, but I think he was heartful. I think they may have been German. I often encounter people from other countries here because San Francisco is a tourist destination. The man's face immediately turned bright red, and he said, "Oh, you must think we're totally stupid." And I said, "No, I didn't. I just presumed that you hadn't seen an arrangement like this before, and being unfamiliar with it, you wouldn't understand that the central cavity is for bottle filling." That didn't seem to relieve his concerns much. And I'm using this anecdote to introduce my topic today, which is imagination. You see, when I approached the man, when I approached the couple, they were engaged in a private activity between them, and so they were experiencing, a private moment, right? They weren't very concerned about being observed. But once I showed up, their sort of social aspect awakened, and now they knew they were not only were being observed, but had been being observed. I just walked through some gnats that are attracted to the tone of my voice. So when I walk through these little swarms, they often land all over my face or my head. They like the resonance, or so I imagine. Now the man imagined, he tried to simulate what I might be thinking. And he was concerned that, oh, we must look very stupid to you. But I'm not motivated in that kind of situation to evaluate people's intelligence. What is dripping down from this tree? In order to understand, sorry, I didn't mean to give you the view up my nose. But in order to understand what is dripping down from this tree, I have to imagine things. And, some of it actually dripped on my finger, but I don't see anything that could be dripping down from the tree. Of course, what I imagine is essentially, since it's a very warm day, I can't imagine water dripping down from the tree. I imagine that there's an organism up there, evacuating digestive and fluids and such, right? But I didn't succeed in discovering what the source of the dripping things from the tree were. Of course, I don't want to spend a great deal of time on it since I'm making a video. See, when I hear that sound, I imagine motorcycles, because that's the sound that I associate. I mean, that's the image that I associate with that sound. That's a learned response. Someone who had never heard engines or motorcycles couldn't possibly have that imagining. So, one of the things that we do as human beings, primarily because I think we're profoundly social organisms, is we try to imagine anyway, how we may be perceived by others. This is a very complex topic and quite profound, because it motivates and inhibits us from all kinds of learning and orientation behavior, perspectives, activities. We often some of us will do things in hope, with the hope of receiving the positive attention of others. That means we were imagining a future moment in which the positive attention of others, the reward of that positive attention, will be directed toward us. And when engaged in things that we might imagine are frowned upon or not encouraged in our experience of other human beings and the societies in which we live, we can imagine receiving the negative attention of, for example, our peers or the members of some group to which we may belong, which could be a religious group or a political group. We can imagine being punished. We can imagine law enforcement officials taking over the rest of our lives, so on and so forth. So we imagine future states, whether consciously or subconsciously. And these both motivate and inhibit us. There are certain things that we might ordinarily do, which we will not do, because we recognize that we would receive the negative attention of other people or punishment or harm, or even just judgment. And it's funny that the guys go to, it's totally ordinary, but it's funny that the gentleman with whom I was speaking, his go-to concern was, oh my God, this guy must think we're completely stupid. But that was no part of my motivation, right? I was actually simply trying to be, like, I had a number of motivations if I look back, right, post hoc, after the experience. When we look back, hindsight is a very astonishing aspect of something we use our imagination for. And by the way, the reason that I'm talking about imagination right now, my purpose is that this oft-maligned, whatever it is this word refers to, which is often maligned in colloquialism such as, you know, it's just your imagination, or you just made that up, or, you know, you're just imagining things, right? If you couldn't imagine things, you wouldn't have a mind. In fact, there's one of the pipevine swallowtails. That's very interesting because I have a cocoon at home, and that pipevine swallowtail must have very recently emerged. Pretty sure it's a pipevine, not positive though. In any case, if you couldn't imagine things, you wouldn't be able to understand anything, and your intellect would not work. Whatever these words refer to is very, it's both fuzzy, right, in that, so Frege, a philosopher, who I guess maybe was in the late 1800s, I might have that wrong, he wrote this essay. Its title's been translated in various ways. The title that I have in my book on the philosophy of language is On Sense and Nominatum. Nominatum. On sense and nominatum. And when I say the tree, right, I'm using a token or a sign to refer to something that hopefully can be experienced by others nearby. For example, that. So the tree can be understood to be the nominatum of the sign or token I'm using in an act of reference in language. So the token points at some phenomenon or situation or circumstance or quality or characteristic or activity. You know, verbs point at processes, nouns point at things. And language is both useful and very dangerous because it confuses the hell out of us. We confuse the terms with the things to which they refer. We confuse the terms with completeness. We think, when I say the tree, I've completed. I know everything about. Once I can name it, I know all there is to know about it, right? Like, oh, the bird, you know, in the child's mind, and the mother goes, oh, it's just a sparrow. And the next time the child sees the thing, he's like, oh, the sparrow, right? It takes away a sense of wonder and mystery and imagination. Naming can very often demagicalize our experience, so that believing that we now have a grasp upon it, our imagination no longer relates with it in a way that is nourishing and profound and effusive and evocative. Perhaps I might even use the term romantic. And some of us will say, well, that's an advance, right? We don't want to just go around imagining things. Yeah, but that's not... There's a useful concern expressed in such language, but... There's a blue jay like right next to my head. There's a useful concern expressed in such language, but it's entirely misguided in that, again, It's framing imagination, that with which it actually forms its concern, as something we would like to put reins on, right? We'd like to put a muzzle on that thing. We'd like to avoid giving it too much liberty. And certainly the faculties that imagination brings to consciousness, of course, I'm gonna have to back up. The faculties contain dangers, though. So I'm gonna back up because we have these words like consciousness, awareness, imagination. These refer to they are not like the word tree, right? In that the word tree refers to something external to me that I can lay hands on, yeah? I can validate that the tree exists as a physical structure, and I can use both conceptual thought and language to distinguish a specific tree from the trees, or the land, or the living beings, or the objects. Categories are very important in language, in ways that I'm not going to attempt to elucidate today because it would lead me on a bird walk. But the nature of our categories and our relationships with them in our minds, with our minds, determines many features of what it is possible for us to have experience of. So when we change the meaning, scope, or lexicon of fundamental categories, we are transforming what is available to our perception, imagination, experience, relation, and so on. So these words like consciousness, imagination, awareness, cognition. By the way, I was tapping fingers while I was doing this. They're very important in that they represent a good portion of what we have to refer to mental activity. Though we have adjectives like wonder and awe and reverence and disgust and hatred and love and things like this that refer to feelings. But feelings are an aspect of conscious experience, possibly accepting what happens to us in dreams. At least one of my friends is unwilling to call what happens in dreams experience, because he wants to segregate that into that which is experienced while awake. But these words refer to things we can't lay hands on. They are names for aspects, or even for the whole of our mental experience. So consciousness can be understood to refer to all of our experience, though there are some people who would say things like, well, no, that refers to experience of which we are aware, right? That upon which we can consciously reflect. There's different ways to use these words, and people with different purposes will use them differently. But what I want to point out is that they're quite vague. They're fuzzy. It's not clear exactly what it is they refer to. The nominatum of these words is malleable. Yeah. It may, in some conversations it will include some aspects of mental experience or activity. In other conversations, others. In some it will just be very vague and a kind of casual term, like the term mind. What do we mean by this? But what I want to point out is that all of the faculties that shape our awareness, oh wow, what is going on here?
She doesn't go to the famous suite one that looks like she even left. Right.
So I doubt the camera will capture this phenomenon, but it's essentially raining under this tree. And I can't tell what is producing that. So because of the light and the angle of the light, I'm able to see what looks like very small droplets, though they could as easily be dust as liquid, raining down from the tree. Huh. And I don't know. There's an amazingly, I'm going to presume it's probably dust. But once again, in order to do so, I have to imagine things. So, our often maligned faculty that we call imagination has a lot to do with how we, first of all, in order to understand something, in order to understand the words I'm speaking, or to form your own, you have to use your imagination. There's pretty much nothing that we do with our minds, intentionally and even unintentionally. Consciousness is sort of it can be thought of as the produce of the engaging of our imagination with memory and phenomena around us or within us. I may feel pain suddenly in, for example, my ankle. I will refer to my memory and think back and try to determine if I can recall injuring my ankle. If I can't, I may try to imagine what could be causing the pain. So when we look at something and we retrieve the token that refers to it, the tree, the bird, the wind, the stuff falling down from the tree, we use our imagination in an attempt to, well, we can use it for all kinds of different things, including things we might not be commonly familiar with. So, last night I watched a video about an animal communicator who visited a black panther, actual cat, at a preserve, and the panther was very disturbed, angry at people, and it's certainly reasonable for people to be skeptical about animal communicators, and some of them are probably phony. Determining whether or not they are doing what they say or whether they're making things up, in other words, lying, requires our imagination and inclinations like purposes and feelings and intuitions and also habits of thought, what we're willing to entertain, as an idea. And that entertaining requires imagination. But in watching this video, there was a lot of the male of the couple that runs the preserve was extremely skeptical in the beginning. You could hear him. He was trying to say, in his mind, there is a 0% chance that you can use your mind to communicate directly with animals. I've been around animals my entire life. There's no, extrasensory perception going on. I don't believe they have an interiority like ours. He was implying all these things. And he was extremely skeptical. The animal communicator was well known and obviously pretty skillful. And I've known a couple myself, and I have some degree of this ability myself. Or at least I imagine that I do. And believe that enough to, to say it. So most of the stuff she had to say in talking to the cat, who normally wouldn't let any human near his enclosure, but calmed down immediately when she showed up, apparently. Most of what she had to say was stuff anyone could kind of make up, right? Oh, he's unhappy, he's mistreated, he's in a very small cage, he doesn't want anything to do with humans, he believes that people have expectations of what kind of behavior he's going to do, so on and so forth. He's a regal, noble animal, an embodiment of kind of celestial wisdom, so on and so forth. The kinds of things materialists would really frown on, but that also the kinds of things that people who have wild metaphysical ideas would celebrate. There's both sides of the spectrum, right? There's the probably wildly over-enthusiastic and confused people who have a metaphysical model, and there's the people who have absolutely zero ability to think of or relate with anything other than the raw physical situation and what they can observe and think about pragmatically. Somewhere in the middle, or above the middle, is what's usually going on. And that somewhere is accessible to us. But we have to be both imaginative and sober, in my view, to get access to dependable opportunities and understandings and perspectives that are both pragmatic and open-ended, so that they don't cut us off from the often astonishing abilities of our human imaginations. So anyway, in the exchange, the woman eventually said, the animal doesn't like its name, doesn't like what you're calling it. They called the animal Diablo. And the video is called How Diablo Became Spirit, which is really about how the name the humans were using to refer to this animal was changed. But the animal communicator mentioned that the Black Panther was very concerned about a pair of kittens that were with it before it was removed from the place where it had lived. And that tiny piece of information was what convinced, there were a lot of features of things that happened that convinced the man that actual communication was going on. But that was the clincher, because apparently, again, according to this story, and we don't have the evidence in front of us, we can't examine, the history of this cat, where it lived before, whether or not there were kittens, if there were two, what actually happened to them, if the whole thing wasn't just kind of made up. We can't really know that from watching a video, right? We may have a feeling about the veracity of the people involved and what they're portraying. But videos are made to entertain and amaze and engage us, so there's a danger that we're being misled, right? And the pragmatist will notice this danger immediately, because it has a shape-based likeness with their concerns and also their orientation. They want to see through the stuff that would mislead us, and that's a reasonable goal. I appreciate the usefulness of a goal like that. But the pragmatist or the materialist may be disinclined to entertain the idea that minds can touch each other and share information non-verbally simply through the faculty that we refer to as the imagination. And that's the faculty with which, if it is possible that minds can touch each other at a distance, non-verbally, in dreaming, in visionary states, and learn from each other and transmit and receive information, the imagination is the faculty with which this occurs, in which this occurs. But again, it's the faculty with which it's the same faculty with which the critic will deny that this is possible or anything like their experience, or so on and so forth. It's the faculty with which the critic forms criticisms. But it's also the faculty with which human minds achieve seemingly impossible tasks in science, for example, like the theories of relativity of Einstein, or the incompleteness theorems of Gödel, his best friend, or the layered infinities of Cantor, a man who believed that if we could understand the nature of infinity, it would reconnect us with the divine intelligence from which our own minds spring. Now, Gödel and Cantor are known to have been insane, which means that their imaginations were not merely astonishingly adept faculties with which they could ascertain and prove the nature of mathematical and physical truths. They were also dangerously, oh yeah, here's more of the little tiny gnats that respond to the music of my voice. They were dangerously intelligent, right? They were so intelligent that their minds were capable of imagining things that were both unlikely or potentially could not be true, or simply were not true. Gödel apparently imagined that people were trying to poison him, would have his wife taste all of his food. He died of inanition in a sanitarium, I believe. I don't know what became of Cantor or what his particular delusions may have been. But I will not dismiss his assertion that there's a relationship between understanding infinities and the origin of consciousness. I myself have had some experience of unusual visionary states in which, how shall I put this? In which numbers and orders in numerism acquired non-ordinary connotations in a way that led me to discover demonstrable features of numerism that were previously invisible, at least to me. So these men and many women who I cannot here name, maybe Emmy Noether, if I remember correctly. The mathematicians who gave us the incredible discoveries upon which our modern technology depend. These people had astonishing imaginations and very unusual ways of relating with their imagination. Very sophisticated, systematic ways that led them to see patterns in information, in nature, in relationships, that led them to formalize those patterns and led to astonishing discoveries. Imagination, making things up, visualizing things, is a crucial underlying feature of the nature of minds. And in our hurry to dismiss certain kinds of nonsense, what we might refer to as delusions, humans may become a little too excited and throw out the universe with the bathwater. When we hear stories, it is our imagination that weaves them into something we can feel and relate with and understand and follow the thread of. That requires imagination. So today I'm here to sing the praises of this faculty, this oft maligned faculty of our human experience, while acknowledging the dangers. Our minds are such that under certain kinds of stress or intoxication, disease, certain genetic predispositions, our imagination can produce delusions. And it's not that there are only two sides to this phenomenon, delusion or prodigy, right? Prodigy can partake of delusion, and delusion often masquerades as prodigy. It wants to be seen as a peculiar form of insight, the form, often, a form relative to what we would think of as the theories or discoveries of an incredibly skillful detective. Delusions often masquerade as insight. And in the mind of the one deluded, they take on this appearance and this array of qualities. Many of us have known people profoundly, what is the right word? Profoundly aroused or disturbed by the overwhelming feelings and urgent purposes that accompany delusion. Some of us have experienced that directly. Most of us who have, many of us who have, will want to insist that even once the delusion passed, if it did, we were aware within its grip of a fundamental quality of seeming insight that was associated with the delusion. And people who've experienced delusions will point out, for example, that many astonishing scientific discoveries were initially dismissed, right, as delusional. Who would have believed, if it hadn't been proven, that the energy held within physical matter is quantitatively equivalent in some particular aspect of measurement, joules or whatever, to the mass of that physical element times the speed of light squared, presuming that light actually has a speed. An idea that I find at once admissible but probably primitive. I think we have the wrong idea about what light's doing when we call when we call its apparent velocity a speed. It is with my imagination that I question that. Yeah? But people who've experienced delusions will say, well, they didn't believe so-and-so, they just missed this person's astonishing insight about the nature of reality too. I'm just another one of those brilliant people who's not yet understood. And they may cling very fervently to this position. Some of them will cling so fervently as to sacrifice their lives for it. It's unfortunate. Now, of course, no one can say for sure that there's no useful content at all in the delusions of the people who are suffering from madness. Because it's impossible to completely dismiss their ideas and perspectives and theories. And often, if we look at them from the perspective of psychology, we will see that there's a an underlying message about the psyche of the person in the grip of the delusion, in the shape of the delusion, in a way not entirely dissimilar to how the plot description of a dream can, in some cases, provide insight into the psyche of the dreamer. And then again, in some delusions, there may actually be a kernel of fundamental insight that if we could only translate the figures, the structure of the delusion intelligently, for which we would need our imagination, we could derive some astonishing, prodigious discovery from the delusion. And yet, for most of us, when someone comes to us in a state of delusion, we're going to recognize and be very concerned. Humans are concerned about the contagiousness of insanity. As we can see by looking at our modern cultures, various common forms of insanity are incredibly contagious, thanks in part to the imagination. But that's not the only thing going on. I think if I wanted to highlight one specific thing about our imagination, or what we are referring to with this word, it would be that the imagination is the source of faculties, abilities, opportunities that are prodigiously diverse and profound. And many of these opportunities and faculties will never be experienced by the majority of us in our lifetimes, because we've been told stories and we've been given descriptions of what's possible and impossible, what's viable and not viable, what's true, what's false, what's nonsensical. It's very ironic that the disciplines whose discoveries depend fundamentally on imagination, disciplines like science, pragmatism, critical thinking, these very disciplines often submit an unjustifiable critique of the faculty they all depend on, the imagination. And when the woman in the video was communicating with the animal, she was using her imagination to do so. Literally, she was intentionally transmitting images to the animal and receiving images which she could then translate into things that humans could understand in language. This is these faculties are pre-verbal. They do not depend on language. Language can directly interfere in them, because language and the use of language, like I'm doing now, I'm speaking, restructures consciousness. The reception of language restructures consciousness. And when we're in a primarily verbal state, our consciousness is being restructured in that specific way. And the state that produces, receives, processes, and transmits images, which is the precursor to the technology that we call television, that faculty has been lost to nearly all of us. Yet I claim that it is entirely natural and available to nearly all human beings. That is, that we can communicate non-verbally using our imaginations, coupled with emotions that might be understood to be the if images are the content, emotions can be understood as the energy that bridges the gap between presuming there is a gap, we may have that wrong, between minds, or crosses the separation we imagine to exist there. We don't really know, there's something we don't really know about minds, which is whether they are the product of a unified field effect, right? If our individual minds are like the leaves on a single tree, fundamentally unified by an order of existence that's not usually apparent to us, or whether they are distinct and we form connections, which is the common narrative, right? That's the formal narrative. That minds are distinct and we form connections, and primarily the only way we can form those connections is either by speaking or being in proximity to one another, with, you know, the exception of telecommunication and so on and so forth. I strongly suspect the former model is the correct one, that minds are the local expression of participation in a form of unity, that the analogy of leaves on a tree isn't bad, but you could use something else like fish in the ocean, where there's an apparent distinction between each fish, and yet the body of water that is the ocean unifies all of them, and they all emerge from it, in it, and live in it, and so on, die in it, and so on and so forth. But my fundamental goal again today is just to highlight that it is our imagination with which we can recover, explore, and experience the faculties and opportunities of forms of awareness that would to us appear miraculous. In fact, they are ordinary, but because we have been so long separated from them, because we have so little experience of them, and most of our narratives either misframe them with wild metaphysical or religious ideas, or inhibit or eliminate them with critiques and statistics. Though there are a few researchers who have been using statistics in an attempt to demonstrate the existence of what we would call non-ordinary faculties of mind. All of these depend on the imagination the same way the ordinary faculties do. The question is, can we step beyond the critical stories and the nonsensically effusive stories to actually explore and recover the faculties that are native to our human experience of consciousness, of awareness, of being, of heartfulness, of wonder, of poignant desire to step beyond the dry and uninhabitable models of the societies and cultures in which we modernly participate. We can. And one thing that helps us to do that is when we feel encouraged, reassured, and inspired to explore without regard to who's watching, who's going to criticize, even who's encouraging. We can certainly find media that encourages us to step beyond the relatively limited models of consciousness, ability, awareness, and our faculties. We can find material that encourages us to step beyond that we shouldn't trust, because it's designed to place us in a trance-like state where our suggestibility will produce results that are not actually realistic or dependable. So on the one side, that's a realistic concern. On the other side, we don't want such critical pragmatism that we have no chance to discover the many forms of wings that I believe our human imagination gives us access to, or is natural, right? The many forms of wings that are natural to our imagination and to our visionary capacities as human beings, particularly when motivated by a deep and trustworthy inner passion. For it is passion that helps the imagination across barriers and boundaries that might otherwise seem impassable. In order to even make the video that I'm making, I have to imagine viewers. To speak the words I'm speaking, I have to imagine listeners. So you can see just how profound our actual relationship with imagination is if we look carefully at all those features of our human thought, experience, behavior, feelings, inclinations, apprehensions, reprehensions, and so on. All of these things, our fears, our desires, our victories and our failures, they are all motivated and evaluated in imagination. So maybe we can stop thinking about this astonishing array of faculties, potential and actual, in such a primitive way, and begin to embrace the vast spectrum of possibility that this wonderful gift of our human incarnation brings to each of our lives in ways as unique as they are diverse.